Okay, we're going to pick up in this second video by looking at non-constant growth stocks and how to value stocks that pay dividends that aren't growing at a constant rate. One particular application of this is a stock that has a growth rate of their dividends that's much higher than the discount rate. And recall that that's a requirement to use the constant growth model. The growth rate of the dividends has to be less than the discount rate for that model to work. But what if we have a growth rate of dividends that's higher than the discount rate? Well, the assumption is that that can't go on indefinitely. And so we're going to use here a two-stage model. So it's a way to handle non-constant growth stocks. And what we do is break it down into two stages, where the first stage is the supernormal growth, or the non-normal growth, might be a more general way to put it. And what we're going to do in that first stage is just determine what the dividends are going to be paid during this time where the dividends aren't growing at a normal rate. And we're going to just look at these cash flows that the investor will receive from the dividends during stage one. With stage two, what we're going to do is define that as the stage where there is normal growth of dividends. And at that point, we can determine what the price or the value of the stock will be at the beginning of this stage, this normal stage, by using the dividend discount model or the Gordon growth model that we looked at in the previous video. So what we're going to do at the end of all that is put all of the cash flows in a timeline, and we'll find the present value, or the NPV, of all of the cash flows that the investor will receive. And this is probably best explained by looking at an example. So let's go to this next slide and look at one. We're going to look at a company that has paid a dividend, just paid a dividend of $2. So that's a special code word for D0 equals $2. The dividend is expected to grow by 30% per year for the next 3 years, and then 6% per year thereafter. So the 6% is the normal growth rate. The required rate of return on the stock is 14.5%, and what we want to do is find out what the value or the price of that stock should be. So the first thing we need to do is determine the dividends in the stage one, in the non-normal stage. So the first dividend, D1, is going to be equal to D0 times 1 plus growth rate. And I've denoted that growth rate because we have different growth rates in this example. Growth rate 1, which is 30%. So if I multiply $2 times 1.3, 1 plus the growth rate, I end up with an amount for the first dividend, the dividend at time period 1, of $2.60. The dividend at time period 2 then is going to be the dividend at time period 1, again grown or compounded by 30%. So if we grow that by 30%, we end up with the dividend at time period 2 of $3.38. And if we repeat the process one more time for that third year of special growth, supernormal growth, we end up with the third dividend payment of $4.39.4. And I always like to include at least out to 1/10 of a penny. One, because it makes the math work cleaner, and two, because frequently companies do actually pay dividends in fractions of cents per share. So it's not just for the mathematics of it, but there's also some relation to reality here. Stage one, we've got our dividends calculated all the way out to the normal growth stage. So that happens in year 4. So let's move to the next slide and see what we do here. The second part of this is to determine the value of the stock at the beginning of stage 2. So we need to find the first dividend of the normal stage of growth. And then we're going to use that in the valuation formula that we looked at last time, where the price at any time period t is equal to the next dividend. So that's denoted by D with the t plus 1 as the subscript. And then we're going to divide that by the required rate of return, take away the growth rate. So RS minus G. So in this case, we need to find out what the dividend at time period 4 is, so we can find out what the price at time period 3 is. If we go back to how we're going to handle this, we want to determine the price at the beginning of the second stage, and that's really the end of the first stage. Those are the same points in time. So we're going to find the price at the end of time period 3. So price at time period 3 is going to be equal to the dividend at time period 4. So we can find the dividend at time period 4 being equal to the third dividend, or D3, multiplied now times 1 plus the normal growth rate. So we're going to multiply it times 1.06. And so we get a value for D4 of $4.65.8. We're going to divide that by RS minus G. So in this case, the RS is 14.5%. The G, that's the normal growth rate, is 6%. And when we do that math, we end up with a value of 54.80. And again, this is our estimate of the value of the stock at the end of the supernormal stage or the very beginning of the normal stage. Both of those are the same thing. So the last thing we do here is find the present value of all the cash flows that the investor will receive. So let's think about each of those. 260 is D1. 338 is D2. And then at the end of time period 3, an investor would receive these two cash flows. They would receive D3, which is $4.39.4, and they would also receive P3. So D3 and P3 in the third year. We add those together, and those are the cash flows that the investor would receive at the end of time period 3. So if we take the present value of all of those cash flows using 14.5% as our discount rate, we would end up with an estimate of the value being $44.28. And let's go to the spreadsheet again to look at this a little more closely and within the context of a spreadsheet. So we've got the non-constant growth here. This is the first example. We got dividend just paid, D0 of $2. We're growing it by 30% for the next 3 years. And so we've already gone through these calculations. You can see where they're all coming from. So D3 is going to be $4.39.4. D4, we're going to grow that now by 6%. So we've got all of the dividends figured out in the first stage, and we've also calculated the very first dividend of the normal stage. We're going to need that as we move to the next step in this process. So step 2 is to find the value of the stock at the beginning of the normal stage or at the end of that special growth stage. So here we're going to just use the formula. The price today is equal to the dividend next period divided by RS minus G. So we're going to use the dividend at time period 4, which is $4.65.8, divide that by the RS minus G, so in this case 14.5% minus 6%, and we end up with a price of $54.80 at the end of time period 3, so that's P3. Then we're going to find the present value of all these cash flows. So I've lined these out here. I've got the dividends and then the stock price, and this column right here represents the total cash flows to the investor if we assume that they're holding it for 3 years. So $2.60 dividend, $3.38 dividend, and then the sum of the dividend and the stock price. If I take the present value of all that, and I can here use the NPV formula, the NPV function, where the discount rate is 14.5%, and then I highlight each of the cash flows, I come up with the $44.28 that we had on our slide. So that'd be a way to calculate the value for this non-constant growth stock. I want to look at another example here, and we're going to now have a variety of growth rates over the course of time. So we're going to have a company with a dividend just paid, so that's D0, of $2 per share. The discount rate in this example is 10%, and we have a variety of growth rates over the next few years. So we've got 12% in year 1, 10% year 2, 8% year 3, and then 6% thereafter. And this is maybe a slightly stylized version of how growth rates would change over time. They're generally going to diminish until they hit that constant growth rate. So here we don't have just one special growth rate. We've got 3 actually before we get to our constant growth rate. But that doesn't change really the process here. For part 1, we're still going to find the dividends. So if we go through and calculate each of these starting with D0, we can grow that by 12% in the first year. We grow it by 10% in the second year. We grow by 8% in the third year. And then by 6% in the fourth year. So we've got our dividends all lined up. And by the way, this fourth dividend is the very first dividend of our normal stage. All right, so we can move on to step 2 here and find the value of the stock at the beginning of the normal stage or the end of the special stage. Again, I'm going to find the price at time period 3 using the dividend at time period 4, all divided by RS minus G. In this case, my dividend at time period 4 is $2.82. I'm dividing it by RS minus G. RS in this example is 10%. The growth rate is 6. So once I divide the $2.82 by the 0.04 that's left over there, I get this value, $70.52, as my estimate of the value of the stock at the end of time period 3. And then I move on to find the present value of all of the cash flows. So we've got dividend at time period 1, the dividend at time period 2, the dividend at time period 3, the price at time period 3, and then this column again is the sum of all of the cash flows at the particular points in time. So if I find the present value of those 3 cash flows, I get a value of the stock of $59.05. So this is another picture of it, kind of on the timeline. A slightly different way of looking at things. I'm discounting each of the cash flows that I'm receiving. So in the first period, I'm receiving $2.24. Let's go up here. Yeah, that first dividend is $2.24. When I discount that back one period, it's worth $2.04. The second cash flow is a dividend of $2.46. When I discount that back, it's again worth $2.04 in today's money. The third dividend is $2.66. When I discount that back, it's worth $2. And the price at time period 3 is a function of the dividend at time period 4. Remember, the price at any time period is related to the next dividend payment. So the price at time period 3 is the $70.52 that we got a minute ago. If I discount that back to time period 0, it's worth $52.98. And if I add up the present value of all those cash flows I'm receiving, then again I end up with $59.05, which is the same number that we just calculated using the NPV formula. A couple of other things I do want to mention. I've talked about selling the stock at the end of the kind of the special growth stage. This valuation model does not require that. I think it's helpful to think of it that way, but it doesn't require it. Let's just look at what would happen if I waited a year to sell the stock. So we could solve it the exact same way. The only thing I would do here is look at D5 to figure out what P4 is. And D5, the dividend at time period 5, is equal to the dividend at time period 4, growing at 6%. And remember that 6% is the normal growth rate. So my dividend at time period 5, D5, is equal to $2.99. The price at time period 4 is going to be equal to D5 divided by RS minus G. And so if I do that math, I get this number here, $74.75. Again, if I look at all of the cash flows that I receive over now a 4-year holding period, I've got a dividend at time period 1, a dividend at time period 2, a dividend at time period 3. And for year 4, I've got both the dividend and the stock sale. And if I find the present value of all of those cash flows, add them all up, again, I get the same result, $59.05 that I had before. So just by virtue of the math of this model, it doesn't really matter when you assume a sale of the stock. We're just trying to find the value, and it's maybe easiest to think of it that way whenever you're following the process. And again, over here, I've just broken up each of the individual present value calculations. This is the present value of the first dividend. This is the present value of the second dividend. This is the present value of the third dividend. And this is the present value of both the fourth dividend and the sale of the stock, or the stock value at time period 4. And if we add all those up, again, I get $59.05. So we're going to stop here, and we'll pick up with the free cash flow approach in the next video.
locality, something crossed me mind. When I looked behind, no bundle could I find. Upon me sick a wobbling, inquiring for the road. Said me Connacht Grove wasn't much in vogue on the rocky road to Dublin. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Hut the hare and turn her down the rocky road, all the way to Dublin. Whack for Lully-Ra. From there I got away, me spirits never failing. Landed on the quay just as the ship was sailing. The captain at me roared, said that Nora Maddie when I jumped aboard.